Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bob Wan, a PhD candidate in economics. It's my pleasure to present my work. I look forward to your suggestions and advice. My research is about the trichoid family structure and the intergenerational unlinked mobility. The trichoid family structure has changed over time in the United States. According to the Parental study of income dynamics, the PSID surveys, the percentage of the two-parent families among all the families with at least one child has dropped from 75% in 1968 to 64% in 2017. In my previous studies, I've shown that growing up in a two-parent household increases the adult child's earnings by 8%. Holding parental and child factors constant. In this paper, I would like to answer the question of whether the trichoid family structure affects the intergenerational unlinked mobility. That is to say, whether growing up in a two-parent household encourages intergenerational relative unlinked improvement. I define the variable growing up in a two-parent household as the children living with both parents for all the 16 years of their childhood. If their parents had ever divorced, separated, or become a single parent at any time during their 16 years of childhood, their children would not be considered as growing up in a two-parent household. I will also find out how the effects vary with parental and child factors and look into the mechanism that links the trichoid family structure to the intergenerational unlinked mobility. I will take advantage of the family descendant structure of the sample and run a family fixed effects model to account for the family-specific heterogeneity. I will also use an instrumental variable for the trichoid family structure and run a two-stage least squares. I find positive and significant causal effects of growing up in a two-parent household on the intergenerational unlinked persistence and intergenerational relative unlinked improvement. The effects vary with parental educational level and the child's gender. To identify the causal effects, I adopt three strategies. First, I try to obtain the ceteris paribus effect, meaning that all other relevant factors are held constant. I include the parental household income and the parents' educational level in the model to disentangle the trichoid family structure effect from the other parental influence. The parents' income and the parents' education are correlated with the parents' marital status and therefore the family structure, and they also determine the child's adult earnings and therefore the unlinked mobility between children and parents. Including the parents' income and parents' education, the model is to separate the trichoid family structure effect from the parents' income effect and the parents' education effect on the intergenerational unlinked mobility. The child's demographic characteristics are also included in the model as control variables. There were unobserved factors that affect the trichoid family structure and the unlinked mobility and will lead to omitted variable bias. Some omitted variables could be family-specific, such as the family traditions and genetic characteristics that are passed down over generations. The family-specific factors could be captured by the family fixed effects. Let's take a look at the family descendant structure of the sample. I draw a family tree to show this structure. The PSID surveys have followed the children as they grew older and formed their own families, making it possible to link the children's information to their parents. The descendant of an original family could be siblings or cousins. They could be the same generation or different generations. I assume that there's something in common that runs in the blood across generations of descendants, which could be captured by the family fixed effects. In my sample, there were 1,392 families like this one, but with different number of descendants. The structure allows me to run the family fixed effects model to account for the family-specific heterogeneity. Even after the family-specific factors have been controlled, there could be concerned about other omitted variables that are individual-specific. So I use the average state divorce rate over the child's 16 years of childhood as an instrumental variable for the endogenous trichofamily family structure and run two-stage least squares estimation. There are two measures of the intergenerational unlinked mobility. The first one is the unlinked elasticity, which is beta 1 in the log-log model. It measures the percentage change in the child's unlinks with respect to a 1% increase in the parent's unlinks, holding other factors constant. A higher intergenerational unlinked elasticity implies a high level of intergenerational unlinked persistence and a lower level of unlinked mobility. The unlinked elasticity is higher for two-parent households than the non-intact families. It is 0.4 for the entire sample. It is 0.5 for the two-parent households and 0.3 for the non-intact families. The family fixed effects models give smaller estimates, but the pattern is the same. The children who grew up in a two-parent household has a higher level of unlinked persistence than the children from non-intact families. This pattern could be illustrated using a graph. The slopes of the two lines are the unlinked elasticities for the two-parent households and for the non-intact families. The former is steeper than the latter. It implies that the children who grew up in a two-parent household have a higher intergenerational unlinked elasticity than the children from non-intact families. The second measure of intergenerational unlinked mobility is the intergenerational relative unlinked improvement. It is a dummy variable. It's equal to 1 if the child's unlinked decile is higher than the parent's decile, 0 otherwise. It is a measure of the upward mobility between children and parents. The linear probability model gives an estimate of 0.086. Probit model and logic models gives close estimates. The family fixed effects estimator is smaller. It implies the presence of the family-specific heterogeneity. The estimate implies that the children who grew up in a two-parent household are around 8 percentage points more likely to improve their relative unlinks than the children from non-intact families after holding relevant parental and child factors constant and accounting for the family-specific heterogeneity. In other words, the children from intact families are more likely to do better than their parents in terms of unlinks compared to the children from non-intact families, all other things equal. In the two-stage least squares, the first stage regression shows a strong correlation between the IV and the trichofamily structure, but the two-stage least squares estimate is not significant at the 10% level. The two-parent household effect on the intergenerational relative unlinked improvement is neither identical for all households nor for all children. It's different for different subgroups. The effect is more significant if the parents are better educated, and it's also more significant for adult sons than daughters. The subgroup regressions give the same pattern as in the interaction analysis. The children who grew up in a two-parent household are more likely to improve their relative unlinks than the children from non-intact families. If their parents are college educated, it is the case. Whereas and family fixed effect specifications. And the two-parent household effect on the intergenerational relative earnings improvement is also more significant for adult sons than adult daughters. When I look at mechanism that links the trichofamily structure to intergenerational relative earnings improvement, I find that the child's educational attainment is the primary mechanism. It accounts for more than 40% of the total effects, and it also helps explain the heterogeneous pattern of the effects. First, the children from intact families have more years of schooling than the children from non-intact families. This is the main reason why the children from intact families are more likely to improve their relative earnings than the children from non-intact families. Second, growing up in a two-parent household has a large effect on the son's schooling. It explains why growing up in a two-parent household also has a large effect on the son's relative earnings improvement than the daughter's. Third, the two-parent household effect on the child's schooling is more significant if their parents are better educated. This is the reason the two-parent household effect on the child's relative earnings improvement is also more significant if their parents are better educated. The pattern of the effect on the child's schooling and the pattern of the two-parent household effect on the child's relative earnings improvement are parallel to each other. To check the robustness of the findings, I try alternative measures of the outcome variables and expenditure variables. I also try another data set, and they give consistent results. In conclusion, the children who grew up in a two-parent household have a higher intergenerational earnings persistence and a higher probability of intergenerational relative earnings improvement. The two-parent household effects are more significant for better educated parents and for sons. The child's educational attainment is the primary mechanism that links the trichofamily structure to the intergenerational earnings mobility. That's it. Thank you.